applied science, which are now dotted around the countryside with very close connections with local employers, and which are largely management, technology, engineering, a range of medical degrees, where typically during the degree you'll be having an internship or do a project with a local company. But those are standard three-year degrees now, and that's really the shape of a lot of German vocational training to come. It's a university-based thing. Thirdly, the industrial focus, of course, has also radically changed. Oh, sorry, Jeff, can you hear me all right?
We can hear you here.
Good, okay. The industrial focus has also changed. It's not a standard service sector economy now, but it's very largely a service sector economy in Germany, though with very good remaining industry. Its huge problems are how you deal with major change. Very good at dealing with incremental innovation. It's very good at dealing via the big Siemens and Bosch and so on with radical change in the United States, which is then translated into incremental change for the Mittelstand in Germany. But the very big changes, of which the decline of the ICE and the rise of battery run cars, and also the development of hydrogen in a big way. These are the big problems which Germany faces at the moment. The big car companies spend a massive amount of money on research. Volkswagen spends almost as much as Google spends on research, 13 billion euros a year. The other big companies are the same as this. So this is a country which is going full tilt to try and work out what to do about this essentially decline of the classic car industry. The move into international investment banking, which was of course very much encouraged in Germany, has turned out to be pretty much a failure. And I would say, and indeed, as we know, Deutsche Bank has retreated very much from that into trying to become an old-fashioned German bank again. The Ruhr is another example where big change was necessary. That's been quite successful. So in the Ruhr, in the 70s and 80s, coal steel collapses. The big companies more or less just disappear from the Ruhr. You have very good land civil servants in North Rhine-Westphalen who ensured a big development of lower-level university education in the Ruhr. But East Germany, to give another example of a major change, and so it's been pretty much of a failure, at least compared to whatever it was that Kohl originally saw of Blumen, whatever it was, in blooming flowers in East Germany. So that's been a failure. Those are things which they're not so good at doing. As far as we're concerned, my own view is we may learn something from what they're doing in higher education. I'm not persuaded that we can copy them in all sorts of other ways because because their civil servants are so well trained, because managers are so well trained, and because there's a lot of cooperation within the system. So why don't I stop at that point? That seems to be about 5 minutes.
Great, thank you. And we can come back to you on anything else you think you ought to have said or want to come in on. I think we will go second to Geoffrey Owen, who is head of industrial policy here at Policy Exchange and has been writing quite a bit about UK what the UK should do to retool its economy. So, Geoffrey, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, this question of learning from Germany has been a kind of long-running theme in my career, and I'm going to offer some reflections on that, dividing my remarks into 4 phases. The first one beginning in the 50s and 60s when I started writing for the Financial Times, and at that time the German economic miracle was in full swing, and there were all kinds of things about Germany which we admired and envied and wished we'd done ourselves. They had a stable industrial relations system. They had a strong apprenticeship system, as David just mentioned, which was very well suited to support these medium-sized engineering companies, which have been such an aspect of German industrial strength. They believed in competition, which we on the whole did not. They didn't nationalize things in the way we did. In general, markets rather than governments were the driving force. So this was the Ludwig Erhardt's social market economy, and it worked extremely well. Then comes the 70s, a slowdown in the world economy, difficult time for Germany, some political changes within the country. And then, of course, in the following decade came the shock of unification, which posed very, very difficult problems. And by the mid-90s, or towards the end of the 90s, Germany was often regarded, given the same title as Britain had had, the sick man of Europe, thought to be too stuck in its old ways, committed to old industries, not able to develop new ones. Some people said they needed a dose of Thatcherism to get the economy moving again. Well, that didn't really happen. And in fact, in the early 2000s, there was early to mid 2000s, quite a remarkable recovery, due in part to labor market changes, shift in industrial relations towards more local bargaining, and Germany benefited enormously from the opening up of Eastern Europe, to which those countries became targets for German investment by the car makers and others, and of course the huge China boom in China, which was just right for the kind of goods, cars, machine tools, and so on, in which Germany specialized. They went from sick man of Europe to economic superstar, as one commentator put it. So then comes the 4th phase. There was a weakness there, and David, I think, has just touched on it a little bit. Of course, and in the last few years, there have been changes, all kinds of changes in world trade, in world competition, and in technology, which have not played so well to German strengths. More emphasis on software, services, data, that kind of thing. And Germany has needed to adapt to a different sort of industrial market in which its traditional strengths in medium technology industries are so strong. And the issue really, and here's the current situation, how best to respond to that change in the kind of business environment, world business environment. Now, David, I'm not sure if I totally agree with David on this point about national champions. I agree that what Altmaier had said on that has been widely criticized, but there does seem to be a bit of a shift towards greater government involvement in industry, a little bit moving closer to a French-style approach, seen most obviously in the battery area, where France and Germany are working together to try and promote a kind of, well, some people talk about an Airbus type solution for batteries. Now, I'm not sure how much that will take place, but I think the point I want to make is that there's a challenge, an adaptation challenge, which other industrial countries, including ours, including the UK, have to face. And I'm not sure that that direction of greater government involvement is the right way forward. If the UK, as the present government has made it clear, they want to develop more UK-based world leaders in high technology, then they shouldn't be looking to Germany for that, because it has very few new world leaders of that sort. but they should be looking more to the United States. That's the country which has the institutional framework and policies which facilitate the growth of new high growth firms. And that's where we should be looking, not trying to imitate Germany.
Thank you very much. And we're now going to go to Shreya Nanda, who's an economist at the Centre for Economic Justice at the IPPR think tank.
Thanks very much for having me. So I'll just talk briefly about some sort of high-level aspects of the German economic model currently, and where I think the UK can learn from those. So first of all, trade unions. Obviously, trade unions play a major role in the German economy at both the firm and sectoral level. This means that workers can all share in the country's economic surplus, which is associated with better outcomes for workers, greater investment in skills and lower inequality, and essentially helps to bring the economy to a high skill, high wage equilibrium rather than risking some parts falling into a low wage, low skill equilibrium, as we see in some sectors of the UK. Secondly, I look at how Germany treats its rentier sectors, so sectors that are primarily engaged with extracting value rather than adding value to the economy. So I'll look at the housing market and the banking sector. So first of all, for the housing market, Germany obviously has a stronger framework of support for tenants, which means that a lower share of national income is monopolised by landlords. And then in terms of the banking sector, so Germany both has a stronger public investment banks play a stronger role in the German banking sector, as do cooperative credit unions. Research last year for the Labour Party showed that public role in banking was beneficial because of both greater levels of counter-cyclical spending during recessions and because of their role in helping to direct investment more productively. And I think that the work that Caroline Sissoko, who's an economist, has done here is interesting. So she links secular stagnation to the scarcity of uncollateralized lending in the UK, which means that entrepreneurs and startups who don't already have high levels of assets find it difficult to access credit to expand and innovate. So more broadly, controlling rentier sectors is good for the economy. It ensures that everyone gets to benefit from the economic surplus, but it also ensures that less wealth becomes concentrated at the top of the economy, not just in a static sense, but in a dynamic sense. So an uncontrolled rentier sector leads to a cycle of inequality where wealth concentrates at the top, and then that wealth is used to lead to more concentration, which leads to more economic stagnation and potentially political instability. Quickly on Germany's response to the coronavirus crisis. So one of the aspects of this is Germany's short working time programme, where during a recession, workers are put on reduced hours and the government tops up wages. So this has the benefit of reducing layoffs and helping to pool risk among workers. I have some sympathy with the argument that we should be concentrating support on individuals rather than on jobs or on firms, but I think that the German approach has clear advantages compared to the UK's approach, which doesn't really, now that the furlough scheme is being wound up, is at risk of not giving adequate support either to jobs or to individuals, because pooling risk means that you are at less risk of spiraling into a negative cycle and a deeper recession. And more broadly, Germany has, if you look at its overall system, it has a stronger and more redistributive social contract. So that's the aspects I've already spoken about, but also more generally, it's higher levels of tax and it's higher levels of benefits and social spending. Again, this means that the benefits of the country's economic surplus are more widely shared, but also in particular, during a crisis, it means that the economy enters a crisis from a strong and resilient position, not from a weak position, with many people on low pay, in insecure work, and with little savings. It ensures that when you enter a crisis, you have these automatic stabilizer mechanisms in place that pool risk among the population, ensure that crises don't lead to undue suffering, and that the government doesn't have to panic at the beginning of a crisis and attempt to reinvent its social safety net from scratch. So those are some of the areas in which I think the UK can learn from the German economy.
Thank you. And now we'll go to our last panelist, Adrian Wooldridge, who is a political editor and badge columnist at The Economist.
Thank you very much. Well, we're clearly going through a German moment in Britain, and we have books such as John Kampfner's Why the Germans Do It Better, which I think is a really extremely well chosen title, given that it sums up, one of the great anxieties of the British. And I think it needs to be pointed out that these sort of cycles of obsession with Germany are recurrent in Britain, as Geoffrey Owen pointed out. But what's interesting in the current cycle is that it's right across the political spectrum. You have the left, as we just heard, being very preoccupied by the German model. We also have the right saying very friendly things about the German model, very different from the late sort of 1990s when magazines such as my own said that Germany was the sick man of Europe. Now we're very, on both sides of the political spectrum, very admiring of the German model. And the last time I think there was such a broadly based obsession with Germany was during the national efficiency movement of the late 19th and early 20th century, where everybody, whatever the question, the solution was Germany. I think there's a lot of projection going on here. We're looking at Germany as what we say about Germany really says something about our own anxieties about our own economy. So when we talk about their regional policy, we're really talking about our own regional inequalities. When we talk about their industrial strengths, we're really talking about our own lack of industrial strengths. And I think a lot of this reflects a sort of anxiety that Britain is becoming a very peculiar, volatile, strange country. A lot of what people are saying about Germany is it's very stable, it's very pragmatic, it's very competent, all of which are qualities that used to be associated with Britain but seem to have disappeared. I would say that, so there's a lot of projection, which really is nothing to do with what's happening in Germany. Also, we've had a very poor record in the past of imitating Germany. The issue of borrowing from Germany's strengths in vocational education, you can see that from the 1880s onwards. We kept saying we need to do it, and we kept failing to do it. Secondly, I think there's a lot to avoid in the German model. I don't share the previous speaker's wonderment at the stakeholder system of capitalism in Germany. I think that goes with a lot of corruption, a lot of cronyism, a lot of closed shopism, and a lot of hostility to dynamism. I would locate the Germans' success much more in their embrace of competition and in the role of the Mittelstand rather than these interlocking structures. In fact, I think, and which brings me to my another point, other countries are very hard to imitate. Their successes depend on a whole series of institutions which are peculiar to those countries. So if we were to introduce stakeholder capitalism in Britain, it would immediately go under another name, which is law-breaking collusion. A lot of their board structures would simply not survive, the first legal test in Britain. So I started out by giving lots and lots of reasons for skepticism, but I do think there's something in this German preoccupation. There is something we can learn from Germany, provided that we're willing to be very self-critical in the way that we do it. One is vocational education. We have clearly overestimated the importance of abstract academic university education in this country. We've overexpanded the universities. We've got too many people with degrees in media studies and not enough people with technical qualifications. The market is telling us that, and we need to do something to reflect that in restructuring our educational system. And there are examples of where we have done the German thing very well. I would point to Warwick University and the Warwick Manufacturing Centre in particular, which has incorporated all sorts of things, the focus on manufacturing, working closely with companies in designing your courses, having apprenticeship systems, everything that we regard as peculiarly German seems to be embodied in the Warwick Manufacturing Centre and has done extremely well for Warwick and indeed the wider region. I would say the German focus on hidden champions is something that we ought to be trying to learn from. And indeed, actually, we have a lot of hidden champions. The trouble is that they're too well hidden, partly because we have a London-based press run by people with arts grad degrees from Britain who don't know anything or care anything about industry, manufacturing or business. So we need to have some mechanism for focusing on these great companies that are there. Regionalism, I think, is absolutely right. If we don't get a more regionally balanced economy, we will have explosions such as the one that resulted in Brexit. And I do think we are getting some good examples of regional policy working. I think Andy Burnham in Manchester is doing good work. He'd be doing even better work if he was given more power as a mayor. So we need to be pushing towards devolution of power and giving greater power, particularly over education, to the regional mayors. And I also think there's something about German seriousness which we need to learn from. Our politics has become too much of a branch of entertainment and too really rather silly, as we've all learned from reading Sasha Schweier's memoirs of her years associated with the Cameron administration. And I think Merkel's pragmatism, her seriousness, her focus, her idea that politics is actually a serious thing that needs long-term focus is something that our whole political system needs to learn from if we're going to go down the road of better regional policy, better vocational policy. So let's have a political revolution followed by a Germanic style regional and vocational revolution. That's it.
Thank you very much. So that's all the speeches that our panelists are going to make, but we're now going to have some questions. Just a reminder that if you want to ask a question, you can hit the raise hand button on your screen and you will be put in the queue. But I'm going to start by asking a few questions myself. And the first one I think I should ask is about competence, because whatever one's disagreements about the politics of the German economy, I think we'd probably all agree that especially the COVID crisis has shown the state and perhaps some of its companies or organizational skills regionally to simply be better than most other countries. And I think and that actually is having a knock-on effect on the whole economy, on the ability of people to go about their normal business and therefore on the economy's ability to recover from next year. So I would like to ask people what they think is the root or the cause of this great competence, and whether such a thing can be imported or re-imported back into the UK, and whether we've lost it, whether our institutions and our civil servants, or even on the business side, our managers, don't value or don't learn the skills needed to actually just execute their jobs to a basic level. So does anyone want to answer that question as to, why is the German state and why are German managers just good at doing the basic job that they do? Anyone want to weigh in on that first? Otherwise, I'll pick someone. Yes, Professor David Soskice.
You're absolutely right. Competence is absolutely central to everything. Capital K ends with a Z. Whenever some new task comes up in a company, there's a long discussion about the competence of the people who are going to work on that to do that. It's one of the reasons why it often takes quite a long time to negotiate things out in Germany. That goes with long-run attachment to companies. So if you spend a lot of time in a company, you definitely want to get the reputation for being a responsible person. And I think the notion of individual responsibility in a collective framework, I lived in Berlin for quite a long time, is something which Germans seem to have to a much greater extent than we do. So it's something you learn very, very early on, that this is a very important thing. You're working in a team and so on.
Does anyone else want to want to comment on it?
Well, I would have thought, Adrian here, I would have thought that regionalism is an important part of this. I mean, if you look at the response to COVID, Germany has what 100 deaths per million. We've got 400 to 500. I mean, it's this competence has had a marked influence on people's lives, you know, whether they live or die, and of course the ability of the country to come back to it. And they just seem to have a much greater willingness to cede decision making to the lander, to the provinces, to locals, but also those locals seem to have a much greater willingness to cooperate with the private sector, private laboratories, private companies, whereas we have been very monopolistic from the centre and very monopolistic, you know, particularly Public Health England, very reluctant to share power with the private sector. So I think it's this tradition that we have in Britain of high degrees of centralisation and high degrees of suspicion of anybody getting in on the act that should be reserved for the central government is something that they've escaped from. But of course, I totally agree with the competence issue.
Can I jump in?
Yes.
So I agree with a lot of those 2 points. I just add that I think that, like, in some ways it's not surprising that after successive governments that have, you know, politically thought that the government should have less of a role in intervening in the economy, that the government, you know, if you have governments that say, no, we're not going to invest in building up these capacities because we don't think the state should be doing these things, then it's not surprising that you get a state that is less capable of doing these things. And similarly, in terms of the private sector, I think that you have to have a government that takes an attitude that it requires active shaping to have a private sector that, you know, you have the institutions that ensure the development of a productive private sector, not one that's just there to try and extract value and make a quick buck. So you have like patient state financial institutions, for example.
Okay, the second point I want to ask about is the vocational side of things, and whether the UK really is up for the German model. I mean, in some ways, the German education system is less hierarchical than the UK. Private schools, for example, play a much smaller role. But on the other hand, vocational training streams people very early in their lives into whether they're going to have a technical education, I think it's at 14, or a more academic one. And there's also if you speak to some German people about their education system, they'll say that a lot of it is about knocking people's confidence down rather than telling them they can do anything or they know everything. And I wonder whether the UK is really, when we talk admiringly of the German education system, are we actually prepared to accept some of those more hierarchical elements of it, especially on the left, which talks a lot about this. So who would want to, does anyone want to respond to that?
Well, I think that's, I think that's changing quite a lot. I think people have become very, very aware of the much too early choice which is being made, and the lowest level of secondary school education, the Hauptschule, are being phased out of a whole lot of Länder. And one of the things about the German system is they do seem really good at being self-critical, so that in the development of certainly the development of these universities of applied science, which have now really become sort of on an even par now with the old universities, a great deal of attention is paid to exactly how much freedom people have, how you work things out, and so on. So I think that's a capacity to actually examine yourself, and to do so within a collective context is actually quite an important part of the whole thing. And what you've absolutely correctly put your finger on about this sort of the early selection, I think that's really been changing, in part in consequence of this sort of self-examination.
Geoffrey,
I
looked
don't
like you might want to say
words
something.
about.
Sorry, Adrian, you go ahead, and then.
Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in, but about the issue of esteem, because I think you're right that there is a sort of hierarchy in the sense of selection, which is earlier than it is in Britain. But I think there's more of a sense that making things, technology, being good with your hands, is something that's dignified in Germany. That it's more of a recognized high status, or not necessarily at least low status, thing to be doing. And partly to do, I think, with the power of trade unions, partly to do with the fact that it's a manufacturing economy with a long tradition of doing those things. But I think it's not necessarily, you don't feel as though you're necessarily consigned to the dustbin if you go down the vocational track. On the contrary, you feel that you've got a key that will give you a career that is reasonably remunerated and is quite dignified. The problem comes, and it's always been the problem, when you translate that into the British context, because we have such a lack of esteem for technical things and for making things. And always when we've tried to imitate the vocational education system, instead of having parity of esteem, we've had the notion that this is a mark really of Cain. It's a mark of failure. And we've constantly ridiculed vocational technical education. And we've got this sort of obsession with abstract academic learning being the highest status, indeed the only status thing that we have. So it's very, very difficult to translate that into the British context.
Geoffrey, did you want to say something? Oh, we can't hear. Sorry, just wait a minute. You've been unmuted. Go ahead.
Sorry?
Yes,
Am I unmuted?
yes, we can hear you now. Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to make one point about the United States, which, like us, the UK, lacks a German-style apprenticeship system. And there have been quite a lot of debate about that, what could be done about it and so on. But that doesn't seem to have held back the growth of the American high-tech sector. Of course, there are all kinds of factors contributing to that growth, high immigration and so on. But it's not 100% clear to me that the sort of industries that we want to develop in this country and which have been or are being developed in the United States hinge on a German-style apprenticeship system. Certainly vocational training needs to be improved, but I think it needs to be considered in a wider context.
Professor, did you want to come back and go ahead?
Very quickly. I mean, I completely agree with Geoff about this. It's sort of obvious that we need to be looking much more closely at the United States rather than Germany. In fact, the American system, I mean, the community colleges in the States do actually provide a lot of perfectly sensible vocational training, which is linked up to jobs. But as far as really high level things are concerned, the Americans spend vastly more on their science departments and so on, and their universities have huge endowments. And the university system in general is one which stresses in a 4-year degree the fact that you don't just as it were specialize in a limited area. You actually do a wide range of different courses in different subjects. A lot of the real specialization comes later in professional schools.
Yes, and one thing I would add on the UK system is that at least in the area of telecoms, we actually have a huge amount, or had a huge amount of expertise. And what's happened in the last 5 to 10 years is that all the students have been Chinese who are taking those courses, and none of them have been British. And that is why we don't have a company to rival Huawei, for example. So our universities are doing all the training, but they're not training British students in that area. So I'm gonna, we've had some written questions from people watching, so I'm gonna ask you guys a couple of those. So does moving towards a Germanic coordinated market economy and away from the Anglo-American liberal market economy not risk the UK falling between the two? Are the two systems so different that mixing aspects of one or the other is more of a risk than choosing to excel in one? Does anyone want to start on that? Geoffrey, yes,
David,
you've been unmuted.
David,
Go ahead.
David is the expert on these matters, but I mean, I think I mentioned the period when Germany was thought of as the sick man of Europe. I think during that period there was a partial move towards Anglo-American capitalism, in the sense that there was a greater awareness of shareholder value. There were more takeovers. People might remember the takeover of Mannesmann, a great name of German industry, taken over by Vodafone of the UK. And I think that these big German companies like Siemens and so on are more aware. Well, they operate in a world financial market, and they have to be more aware of sort of Anglo-American shareholder pressures. So I think although there's still the sort of distinction which David has made is still valid, I think there's been a partial move on the German side.
Does anyone else want to address that question of?
I mean, I think one of the, I mean, it seems to me that we're good at startups, and we should be putting, which is one reason why I think we should be putting a great deal more money into universities, but also paying a lot of attention. I mean, as Adrian said, paying a lot of attention to the structure of our universities. So that they're set up to make it much more easy to provide an environment in which startups occur, and not really too difficult. So if you look at a lot of our big companies, they still seem to be really concerned about relatively short-term financing. I mean, obviously, companies do hire apprenticeships and so on, but that absolutely is the exception rather than the rule. And that suggests to me that we need not to think that we can. It'd be very nice to change some of our companies, but really we should be looking to startups, which is actually where all the big successful high-tech companies in America have come from.
Shreya, go ahead.
I just add, so I think there is a risk of falling in between the two models, and I think the key thing is that we need a fair and more redistributive economic model. That can be one adapted to a liberal market approach, or it can be one adapted to a more coordinated market approach. But I think because I would draw links between secular stagnation and wealth inequality, and especially now that we're at a critical point during this crisis, where if we don't do something, the economic situation is going to get much worse, and lots of people are going to suffer. We do absolutely need to make our system more redistributive, one way or another.
Yeah.
I just wanted to question the extent to which Germany is a coordinated economy, and if it is a coordinated economy, whether that's part of its strength. I would think that the biggest lesson we should be learning in Britain from Germany is not from the coordination front, but from the middle-sized companies, the Mittelstand. I mean, we're good in Britain at producing big companies. We're quite good at producing startups that by European standards, not by American standards. But what we're not very good at is either producing or nurturing middle-sized companies. And what is really fascinating about these middle-sized companies to me is that they're rooted in regions rather than all clustering in London. So they give some life to the regions. You know, if you live in a city, a town with with 1,000 people in it, you don't have to go to Berlin. You can stay in that town because you can work for the local company. But second, that these Mittelstand companies are highly competitive and highly globalized. I mean, basically, they've boomed over the last decade or so because they're providing the stuff that the Chinese use. They're providing, machine tools and things like that. They're powering the Chinese economy. So they've managed to cross these two things of being both competitive and regionally rooted, which are two things that both of which we both desperately need in Britain. So I would put a lot of focus on learning from from the Mittelstand, how they operate.
Can I say something quickly on? Oh,
yes, quickly, yes.
David, do you want to go first?
No, you go first, Ray.
So it was just on Adrian's point about regional and the regional distribution of companies. And I really think that you like that in part comes from the high wage model, because if you have companies paying high wages to their workers who are located near them, then that obviously is putting money back into the regional economy, which allows the regional economy to do well. Whereas if all the profits, go somewhere else and are centralized, then you don't have the same sort of regionally balanced economy.
So could I just come to what Adrian was saying? Of course, I absolutely agree with Adrian that the Mittelstand to the is marvelous. I also agree very much with Adrian that that they're highly competitive companies. What's really interesting about Germany is how that high level of competition and independence which these companies have tie in with a system of technology transfer, which is organized by Land or by the federal government, and which, when new things come along, will take particularly Siemens or Bosch or one of the very big companies and tie and set up a whole framework, which they call about Sion's cluster, where you put together a very big company. So Siemens owns lots of small startups in the United States, and it's monitoring what goes on there the whole time. Taking new things from the United States, working with a group of Mittelstand companies, setting up with quite a lot of state or federal money, and with help from Fraunhofer Institute or local technical universities, and then they work out how to learn how to use these new things. So that's the marvelous and remarkable thing, I think, is exactly this ability to both be highly competitive and at the same time to be very prepared to coordinate at that sort of.
Okay, we've had another question in which I'm going to ask you guys, and then you could start to think about if you want to make any winding up remarks. So the question is, would German federalism be an example for addressing the UK issue of asymmetric devolution, for example, issues like the Barnett formula? So could it solve our political issues as well as some of our economic ones? Does anyone want to begin with that? Otherwise, I'll have to pick someone. Adrian, why don't you?
Well, I just think the extent to which Britain is a centralized country is, the root of our big political problems. We wouldn't have had Brexit without it. I think one of the things that we've learned, the classic argument against devolution was always that the central government is actually incredibly competent and is very good at doing things. And if we give power to local governments, then we're giving power to a bunch of people who are basically amateurs and can't do things. And I think we've had a terrible lesson from COVID that the central government has no monopoly of competence, and indeed that local governments, city mayors and the rest of it, have quite often been better at running policies. So whether it's an answer to asymmetric devolution or not, I'm not qualified to say, but I think that we need to move towards a period of devolution in this country, absolutely centrally, and we need to learn from whoever's good at it, and Germany has certainly been very, very, very good at it, because if you don't do that, the country will blow up.
Perhaps also it might ferret out some more political talent, which the German system is also quite good at.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, does anyone want to talk about that point? If not, we can talk more generally and wind things up. David, you look like you want to say something.
I want just to say, I think we tend to ask these questions about what we should be doing, what policies we should pursue, but almost any sane policy for the UK is going to take necessarily going to take a long time to actually develop. So if I very much agree with Adrian that the level of centralization is bonkers in this country, and that the city regions, the mayoral city regions have simply not been given remotely the degree of devolutionary responsibility and also financial resources and ability to raise money and all those sorts of things, which is the basis for any sane devolution. But those things take a long period of time. It will take a long period of time, for instance, to train really able administrators on quite a big scale to cover the whole of the Greater Manchester, and so on. We don't really have that level of highly trained administrators in different areas of the country. And I think in general, we tend to, partly because of the political system here, we tend to think of policies which we can put in place now, and then, as it were, look tomorrow to see what the results will be. Whereas I think we need to take a much longer term approach to policy making, and same time think more seriously about planning, because while I think competitive markets are absolutely key to everything, I also think that we have thrown out planning as a result of just going over to a sort of market-based way of policy making.
Thank you. Does anyone else have something to say specifically about devolution? Okay, well, if not, maybe we could have you can wind things up, and I'll mention a few things that I think are of interest that we haven't gone into as much. Well, one is the role of labour in the trade union issue. As Shreya mentioned, trade unions have a bigger role institutionally in German companies. On the other hand, their trade unions operate very differently in the sense that they're more on a company or a company level rather than a national level, and perhaps that makes them less political. Another issue is the issue of taxes. You know, whether having a higher tax base, or there's actually some question as to how much higher German taxes are if you take out non-contributory benefits between the UK and Germany. The comparison changes a bit, but broadly taxes are a bit higher there. And then the question of investment, which is actually very low in Germany. And one of the complaints is that, for example, their national infrastructure is slowly declining and crumbling, and that they haven't managed to increase their spending on that. So I'm going to turn it back to you guys in no particular order to wind things up, and if you want to address any of those issues, then you can. Geoffrey, we'll start with you. Oh, sorry, you've got to be unmuted. I'm not sure why we have this issue. Anyway, go ahead. We can hear you.
You can hear me now, yes? Yeah. No, just going back a few steps in the conversation about the lack of startups growing into big companies. I think one thing that shouldn't be forgotten about the UK is, and one of its strengths in my view, is its openness to inward investment. And I think a lot of the companies that have been bought up, for example, by large American ones, have in fact prospered under that ownership, become more international in their orientation. And I think that's a strength which should be, or that's an openness which should be maintained. And I'm slightly worried about the shift towards more protectionism in that area.
Agree with that.
Thank you. David, do you want to go ahead next?
Well, just to follow on from what Geoffrey was saying, I also think that applies to our whole attitude towards immigration. So immigrants have played, particularly Indian immigrants in the States and Taiwan and so on, have played a huge part in building up actually the American high-tech system and then carrying it back with them to India and Taiwan. I think the idea of, for instance, if people from the continent come and do master's degrees in the UK or do doctorates, that they should be able to stay on and then set up companies if they want to do so, or become employed if they want to do so. From exactly the same perspective that Geoffrey is talking about, I very much agree about foreign companies, about multinationals, particularly American multinationals, who have had a really big impact, and I think a very good one in this country.
Thanks. Shreya, we'll go to you next.
Yeah, so I think on this protectionism debate, I think I might have got this wrong, but I think David recently made the point about sort of the immobility of high tech industrial clusters, which I think is a good point. So if you build those up, then your economy is more competitive and less at risk from some other country like sweeping in. And yeah, apart from that, I just reiterate my call for the fact that yeah, I think Adrian was right that it is about our anxieties about the British economy, and my fundamental point is that in the British economy we need a stronger social contract, like a more redistributive social contract, more just system. And Germany, we can look to Germany for like one way to do that, but we don't need to necessarily follow their model. But yeah.
Thank you. And we will finish with you, Adrian.
Well, I just wanted to point to the strange paradox of Brexit, that as we leave the European Union, we seem to be becoming incredibly fascinated by bits of Europe's success. I mean, we're interested in national champions, which is, I suppose, something associated primarily with France rather than with Germany, but we're also incredibly interested in the German model of regionalism, vocational education, and long-term investment, and we're sort of very skeptical as we leave the EU. I think about the Anglo-Saxon model increasingly. I think even from from the point of view of Downing Street, there's a lot of skepticism about that. And the other paradox is that as we try and leave the EU, having great tensions with the EU, which seems to be much more Anglo-Saxon in its approach to things like national champions and competition laws, than we want to be when we're outside the EU. So we're basically leaving the EU so we can be more like what Germany used to be before the Anglo-Saxon model became embedded in the European Union's approach to competition and the rest of it. So freedom in order to be more like them.
And that was me thinking we'd get through a whole discussion on the economy without mentioning Brexit. Thank you to everyone. Thank you to everyone for watching, and thank you to everyone for speaking. That was Shreya Nanda, Geoffrey Owen, David Soskice, and Adrian Wooldridge. I'm Juliet Samuel. I'm a senior fellow here at the Policy Exchange and a columnist at The Telegraph. Thank you very much for watching.
Yep.